So, shall we
Mhm.
get into boozing through the New Yorker?
We shall.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I got
Yeah,
my spiel.
Harry Kunzru, sorry, we're mentioning you after Shakespeare, so sorry, you're not. If you should ever listen to this podcast, which I doubt, we're you're a tough act to follow, but this is a very short story.
Mm.
How about that Tracy, buddy? Let's
It's the
hear it.
1980s. You're a teenage East Berliner and bored and stuff, as a teenager would be in East Berlin under communism. Disaffected and bored, you are drawn like iron to a magnet to punks in the park and attempt to join their clique, which succeeds when you prove your hardness by physically assaulting an annoying bloke with a hard-on for a girl at an illegal punk concert. And you become the inept drummer of a three-piece girl band. Blah, 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 Stasi's, blah, 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 surveillance, blah, 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 the wall falls. And those who are secretly working as undercover informants for the Ministry of State Security have to live with being outed by academics and journalists rifling through the communist files. The story, A Transparent Woman, is about the effects of mass surveillance upon an individual and how it makes her hollow in mind and body, that she does not even own herself. Or as Orwell put it, nothing is your own except the few cubic centimeters inside your skull. In this story that even may be true, but government even in the story that may be true, but government control has made those few cubic centimeters empty. It is interesting, truly. I believe the world and the crumbling facade of once elaborate buildings and the husks of those which are now being lived in. But I kept waiting for the story to actually begin. And when the story ended, I almost suspected the words "the end" to materialize at the bottom of the page and someone say, "Wasn't that nice? That was a nice little story." I tried to read all stories we talk about on this show at least twice. I only read this one once, as it didn't really need for a second reading, and I'll explain that why when we get going. It's a story heavy in plot, thin on other elements that make up this so-called art form. On this episode of Boozing Through the New Yorker, little by little, she fell into a kind of magical thinking, as if reality of had happened to her depended on its being told. On this episode of Boozing Through the New Yorker, A Transparent Woman by Hair Kunzru. I pronounced his name wrong. I'll get it right here. Typos, man. Typos. I wrote this actually late and I didn't proof it. What did you think of the story?
A story?
Mm.
Well,
Hair Kunzru. Hair Kunzru.
Kunzru, Kunzru, yeah, yeah. I again, I'm when it comes to that dichotomy of show and tell, I always love a good tell.
Mm.
I love it when tell is done well, and this is all about tell. This is, there's hardly any characters are hardly quoted here. You
Mm.
hardly see what they, it's as if we're being relentlessly led along by a Stasi agent.
Oh, interesting.
Here's the point you should be paying attention to. You can pay attention to no other.
Mm.
Nothing feels indeliberate about it. It's very oppressive how it's written. And I
Interesting.
think that really fits. It's interesting that this young woman, Monica, the protagonist, this is the East German system, right? Just,
Mm.
okay, I got fired from this job. I'm just going to go here. This person has to hire me. So you have to be hired and you have to have a job
Mm.
at all times. It's a very interesting, even though you might not be productive, even though you might not learn anything, even though your employer might be a Stasi informant, you still have to do it. You have to do it.
Mm.
But it's just how peripatetic her life is. She lives in what, no less than 21 places or something like that at the time of the story. Just bouncing around both before and after the
Mm.
wall falls. I felt I think the author did a fairly good, me being a man and a 245-pound one at that. Insofar as I can imagine what it's like to be a woman on her own, a young
Mm.
woman on her own, you just felt the potential for rape everywhere in this story. It was very creepy. The
Mm.
Stasi agent, obviously being, roll neck, as he's called, who wears the turtleneck. He's the most obvious symbol of this, and he actually does, in effect, rape her at some point in the story. but the idea that you're no matter what you're getting fucked. No matter what you're getting gaslit so brutally
Hmm.
by the apparatus of state that you just cannot you can't say no to it. It's like a rapist who stalks you.
Hmm.
He's got your every ingress and egress figured out. He
And you
just
just
hasn't
lie
sprung the
there. Then you just say, "Fuck it." Like, what am I gonna do? I either fight
right.
it, or which is what she
Well,
does
it's
in
even
the end.
worse than that. It's even worse than that. It's like it doesn't matter if you fight it.
Yeah.
You know, it says it doesn't. It's just fighting it is part of the plan.
Hmm.
You fighting it is part of the like wearing you out until you finally give
Hmm.
in. Offer. It's even worse in this case. It's when you offer yourself
Hmm.
with the appearance of volition.
Hmm.
Like you're fine. You're like okay here,
Hmm.
but of course when Monica cooperates with him, it's anything but volitional. It's all still coercion.
Yeah.
She's
That's what the
coerced to it,
transparent
but
woman is. She's not a person anymore. Like, that's
right,
what it really feels like, and she never becomes really a person again.
right.
And it's
She never does.
it's a I
Even
my
years later after
yeah.
all falls.
I didn't really. It sounds like I didn't like the story. I actually quite did. I found it really entertaining, and to say that about such a horrible thing that happened, but it's so well done. It's very well researched, and I believed every second of it. Right,
Every
like,
second.
believed every second of it. Um, I just felt like it was. It kind of felt like an elaborate treatment for a movie
Mm,
because it was so much tell.
mm,
And I was reading it and I just kept waiting for the story to start. It kind of felt like exposition, right? And then it
right.
just ends and then you leave like, oh, that was nice.
Mm,
I was never, and that was enjoyable. It's quite long compared to some of the other stories we read. And I
right.
read, and of course I did a little bit of reading on it. It's adapted from a novel.
Oh, no
And
shit.
Monica is telling her story to somebody. So
Oh,
this
that's
is
interesting.
all her explaining her life to some. The book is called Red Pill,
Oh,
and it's about surveillance states, and it's some writer American writer who's doing something, running around talking to people, and Monica tells her story to the writer, which I go, oh, like I read it first and I had those thoughts about it feeling like a treatment for a movie, and I would love to see this as a movie. And then I read that and I went, oh, that makes perfect sense. Like, why didn't they say that in the thing? Why did they do this
I
at all?
I kind of like this approach. It's because,
Mm.
in the novel, it sounds like Monica is actively telling her own story.
Yeah.
So in a way, she has power over that story.
Mm.
In this rendition, it's told in the third person,
Hmm.
right? And she doesn't get the chance to tell her own story
Right.
because she never actually does anything in the story.
Mm.
She's almost completely passive the entire time. Everything, even her discovering punk
Mm.
and slamming on a drum. I love the detail too. Her pounding the drums sounded like dead bodies hitting the floor.
Floor.
Like it was just so bad. Like the instruments were bad. It was just passion. There was no
Mm.
skill.
That's a
Uh,
really good point. Her action is getting her
it,
hair,
it's up
cutting
to
her
that.
cutting her head, cutting her hair, becoming a punk is almost like the only action
Putting
she
her
really
right in
has.
the path of rapist,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
So it's like everything she does is fated to slavery in a way.
Hmm.
She's not active at all in any positive sense in the
Hmm.
entire story. Even after liberation, she's not.
No, she just
There's
flees.
nothing liberated.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's nothing to be liberated. It's
Mm.
it's it's just she's almost a zombie, the living dead.
Mm.
And I think it's very interesting. Like you said, though, the Orwellian the Orwellian idiom there
Mm-hmm.
that she does own her brain. It seems she's conscious.
Mm-hmm.
She's able to see it all. Maybe too late at times, but she is able to see it all. But
Mm-hmm.
man, she's just trapped the entire, the Stasi, the East German police state, seeps into the marrow of her being so much so that things are arguably worse for her after the wall falls.
Mm-hmm.
It's just she's just chaff in the breeze, going from city to city until they discover that she was an informant, not knowing, not caring that not every informant was voluntary. Not every informant volunteered, I should say.
She was forced into it. She was outed as an informant without being one, which is, and she just gives up. It's really, it's good. It's really well done. It's a compelling story. Do you like? Obviously, you don't feel the same way about it as I do. Because I just felt like I couldn't get into it as much. I felt like I was watching it, which is maybe
Mm,
part of the effective. Like it's not necessarily a bad effect. I just couldn't connect to it or feel it as much. I felt more observing than anything else. If that, but I'm curious. And the book doesn't. This sounds much more interesting than the actual book does. And the red pill. Like I liked this story. I liked seeing this world because it was so real.
mm,
You
it
know,
was.
the street corners and when she leaves Rollneck and she's out on like just lost trying to like she's got to get somewhere, but she really doesn't really have anywhere to be
Mm,
except for the husk of a building
right.
where the
She
punks
has,
live.
she has nowhere to be. She has nothing to do.
Mm,
She has nobody,
mm,
and it seems as if when the trap is finally sprung, right, when they hustle her into the van with its compartments in the about the middle of the story, you just get this sinking feeling that literally everything she's done, breaking with her
mm,
parents, moving out of her house, uh, not having any not having any durable relationships, not having any real friendships, not having any interest that falls within the parameters of legality,
mm,
within the law. Her only passion is to play musical instruments with the other two members of her band and be in that punk rebellious energy. But that's not an identity. That's not a you can't like it's like Alexei Karamazov says. God, I'm quoting current brother Karamazov
mm,
twice today. You can't live. It's impossible to live in rebellion.
mm.
Can't. So it's just. And then when they finally spring a trap in her, there's no one to tell. She doesn't even think to tell anybody. She has nobody to go. She has nobody to give her life any meaning. Just what do you do?
The interesting
What do you do?
thing, the thing that I thought was kind of interesting about it was that like the punks weren't political. They were
No,
just
they weren't
bored making
bored.
shitty music. Like the lyrics are bad. The lyrics weren't political either. It was just angsty stuff.
Yeah,
And they spend all this resources and time to what the Stasi, I mean, spends all this resources and time to infiltrate this group to know to prevent them from doing what? They'd probably get
right,
older and realize this kind of sucks. I don't want to live here anymore. I'd rather live in the parent house my parents have and be one of those old like cabbage eating women who are in the window with the curtain spying on everybody else because that sounds a little more comfortable than this.
right,
Which is
right,
probably what would have happened because they're just like they're teenagers, which I
right.
thought was kind of an interesting thing to do as opposed to I don't know, like it's not the intellectual groups that they're spying on. Oh,
No, there were none left
uh,
by that time. There were none left. I mean, apparently the official number is that when East Germany was finally liberated from its enslavement behind the Iron Curtain,
mm,
it was discovered that about 1 in 4 East German adults were informants. was an incredibly dense, deep. It was like this, like you said, the Stasi were basically amusing themselves.
Mm.
They were so good at what they did. East Germany was so isolated,
Mm.
and the Germans so efficient at bureaucracy in this twisted sense that they were just inventing problems to police. And, and for the joy, I mean, think of how much pleasure it must have given him and his team to gaslight Monica so cruelly.
Mm.
Like every day she'd come home and fucking shit would be moved around in her apartment. They'd break into her apartment every fucking day
How much power
and
they must
choose
have felt.
personal things to move around.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they got her punk records that there's no way they could have been in East. They had to have them smuggled in from West Germany,
Mm-hmm.
and they put them in her locker. So they had to pick her lock. They had to put them in her lock. It's just, they were just bored too.
Yeah. And the only reason why the reason why they did that was to protect their real informant,
The real
Erica. I
informant,
think her
right?
name
Who
was
is an
Erica.
absolute self-righteous asshole.
Uh-huh.
If there's a secondary antagonist in the story, it's
Mm.
her.
Mm.
She's self-righteous. You know, she's full of energy. Everything just comes very easily to her.
Mm.
She's one of these very magnetic, aggressive people,
Charismatic,
and
probably hot, and
probably pretty hot.
yeah.
And she had it so easy because she was very, very good at informing on other people.
And probably the best part of the story is is after at least what I liked a lot was seeing the world afterwards, and then
Right,
that girl becomes a politician,
right.
and her roll neck sells flowers. She
Yeah,
sees him
he's
son.
some miserable flower vendor.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I thought that
yeah.
was great to see. He's not arrested or anything.
No. Well,
We
as long as he keeps his head down, as
yeah.
long as he, hides under a hat bill, in a market. If he ever tried to get a real job, they'd find him out immediately when they did a background check,
It's
and they'd fucking
pathetic.
put his ass in jail where he belongs.
I almost felt like
Yeah.
when she sees him on the street, Monica, and she flees pretty much because she doesn't like you wouldn't want to see him. But it almost seems like she's fleeing in a sense because of how pathetic he is, and that affects like he's not a powerful man, and he never really was. And she allowed herself. She didn't have a choice, but to be manipulated by him to
Right.
to that degree, and he's just a fucking fat flower seller, flower
And
merchant.
that was, interestingly enough, in a way, she didn't have to talk to him because seeing
Mm.
him in that position where he was quite obviously not in any position of power over
Mm.
anyone is like, oh, she's like, oh my God, it's finally over.
Yeah. Oh,
Oh,
interesting.
yeah. So it's just so they're not putting images of a wall coming down on my television. Like this is real. Like
That's
that's how
interesting.
badly she had been psychologically tortured by this guy
Mm.
that she thought the fucking liberation was another Stasi plot
That was a
to
great point too, right? How many people thought that? How many people thought that?
what was it, a fucking month before the wall fell that she finally decided to go to another town.
Mm.
She's like, ah, fuck it. you
Mm.
know, and of course the uh, the real informant
Mm.
was outed. She got really fat,
Yeah.
and she said she didn't regret anything, and then she kills herself.
Mm. The
Which I
ending.
don't know. I thought it was rather shitty story. Shitty. I shouldn't use that word. I didn't understand the choice to end the story with the informant and not Monica.
You're right.
I don't quite understand why that happened, but
Depending on what it is, has to do with the novel too, right? But that's a good point. Why is she the one that gets the last word? Like,
yeah.
are we supposed to feel sympathetic for her? Because that's kind of what it feels like, right? Like, oh, like she's sad. Oh,
Well, in the same way that the narrative the technique used to end The Sopranos, for instance, was the focus of the story ceases to grow.
mm,
There's no more growth. There's no more. So Tony gets shot. Well, I
mm,
shouldn't say so. It's not causal. But anyway, Tony is the subject of The Sopranos. He is the the figure around which everything turns.
Mm-hmm.
And when he's finally killed, just before he's killed, everything stops. Just cuts to black because the story can't live anymore without Tony being alive in a way. The whole he carried everything. The story's whole job was to tell his story. With the
Mm-hmm.
story over, the story's literally over.
Right.
Maybe when we see Monica catch sight of the Stasi, the brute who ruins her life,
Mm-hmm.
as a flower vendor, she feels relief. She feels it's finally over. I can finally move on.
Mm-hmm.
But immediately she's oppressed by knowing that her former bandmate is the real informant.
Mm-hmm.
So now the dramatic tension is ratcheted up even higher than it was before.
But
So
nothing really happens with that. Mm.
maybe when this old friend dies, maybe the story of Monica's trauma dies with it. Maybe she becomes a different person, and that's a different story to tell.
Mm-hmm.
So that one ends. The story of her in hell is the plot of Transparent Woman, but maybe her journey into her proper life
Mm-hmm.
begins with another story at the moment that this friend dies and the relief that she gets,
But
knowing that it's over.
did we
I
get?
don't know.
But we don't necessarily know if she feels relief at the end. I don't think that is
I think
apparent.
she would.
Right, but it's
Because
not clear.
I think she would if only because she feels relief when when she knows that her psychological torment is over
Oh,
at the hands
okay.
of the Stasi guy, but
Mm-hmm.
she's immediately oppressed once more
Mm-hmm.
with this another antagonist shows up on the scene who
Mm-hmm.
was her comrade and bandmate. So when that's
Flatmate.
resolved,
Yeah.
Flatten, right, at one time closest confidant.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe the story ends abruptly
Mm-hmm.
when the source of this, if you were, conflict, this even greater like sense of betrayal and disorientation
Mm-hmm.
that comes along with learning that she was not even conscripted to do honest work for the Stasi. She was conscripted to do dishonest work for the Stasi so she could cover for the actual informant who was getting sniffed out.
Jesus.
Talk about, you know, it's like you're a body double for a dictator, and
You're not even the number one body
you're
double.
not even the number one body double. You're just killed. You know, you're a body double that died in a bus crash rather than an assassination attempt. You know what I mean? Like, it's just so crazy. It's just nuts. It's like you're the body double of a body double.
Right, yeah.
You're not even like, what the fuck? What did I give my life up for?
You're a decoy.
To look like this guy?
You're the decoy of a decoy.
Decoy of a decoy.
Yeah.
So it's maybe that's why the story ends abruptly. That particular story is quite literally over.
Mm-hmm.
That part of Monica's life
Mm-hmm.
that which began with her leaving her parents' house and leaving herself exposed to the corrosive of East German society without the guidance of her forefathers, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
When she's just out there shaving her head and, pissing in fountains or whatever the hell she was doing. It's that story ends when her former friend kills herself.
Brett,
I don't know.
Do you know what we forgot to do?
The pose!
The pose, man. The pose. So since we are ending the podcast, we will end with the pose. But I'm Darryl. He's Brett. We're boozing. Keep scribbling.